Near the end of the 16th century, a man named John White embarked on a transatlantic voyage. His destination was Roanoke Island, situated along the southeastern coast of North America. 3 years prior, White had established an English colony on this island, and he was now returning to resume his role as governor. After a long and arduous journey, White finally arrived at the site of the colony, only to find that the more than 100 men, women, and children he had left behind had vanished. One of the few clues left behind was a cryptic message carved into a tree. Before White could conduct a thorough search, the ship returned to England, leaving behind a haunting mystery: what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? To understand the mystery of the lost colony, we must first look at the events leading up to its disappearance. The story begins in 1584, when 2 ships sailed across the Atlantic, scouting for a suitable location to establish the first permanent English colony in America. By mid-July, they made landfall on a chain of barrier islands known as the Outer Banks. The English quickly formed friendly relations with the local Native Americans and were invited to their village on Roanoke Island. After about a month, the expedition returned to their ships and sailed back to England. Upon the expedition's return in late September, Walter Raleigh, the man in charge of the venture, immediately began preparations to plant a permanent colony somewhere along the Outer Banks. Shortly thereafter, Raleigh was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I, and the new land was named Virginia in her honor, the Virgin Queen. In April 1585, a fleet of 7 ships set sail from England, carrying approximately 600 men and enough provisions to sustain the colony for a year. The fleet reached the Outer Banks by the end of June, but soon faced a crisis. Navigating the waters around the Outer Banks proved treacherous, as evidenced by several sinking ships. The flagship struck a shoal while passing through a shallow inlet and was nearly destroyed. Since the flagship carried most of the provisions, much of which was now spoiled by seawater, the scope of the colony had to be drastically reduced. Around 100 men, far fewer than originally planned, were stationed on Roanoke Island. With the approval of the natives, they began constructing what would become the Roanoke Colony. The island was chosen primarily for its strategic location, offering quick access to the ocean while remaining hidden from Spanish patrols. Spain had already colonized and laid claim to much of the land the English now called Virginia, so it was crucial to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The second wave of supplies and reinforcements was expected before winter, but the resupply mission was unexpectedly cancelled by the Queen to address more urgent matters in England. As a result, when the colonists ran out of food, they had to rely on the generosity of the Native Americans. However, the natives had limited resources and struggled to meet the increasing demands of the colonists. This overdependence quickly strained their relationship. Meanwhile, the English began to notice a disturbing pattern. Whenever they visited a Native American village, many of the inhabitants would inexplicably fall ill and die. The natives believed the English could kill from a distance with invisible bullets, which was not entirely inaccurate. Unbeknownst to them, the English were carrying deadly diseases to which the natives had no immunity, triggering an epidemic among the indigenous population. On Roanoke Island, tensions escalated between colonial governor Ralph Lane and Indian chieftain Wingina. Their mutual suspicions grew to the point where cohabitation became impossible. Wingina decided to move his people off the island and retreated to a larger village on the mainland. Meanwhile, Lane became convinced that Wingina had formed an alliance with other tribes to launch an attack on the colony. Whether out of paranoia or prudence, Lane decided to strike first. On June 1st, 1586, Lane and his men attacked the mainland village, massacring its inhabitants. One of the Englishmen chased down and decapitated Wingina, and his head was later displayed on a stake outside the colony's fort. A week later, a large English fleet, commanded by the renowned sea captain Sir Francis Drake, stopped by the Outer Banks on its way back to England. Given the lack of food and the violent clashes with the natives, it was decided to abandon the colony. The colonists were hastily evacuated from the island, and after 9 long months, they all returned to England, except for 3 men who could not be located in time. They were left behind and were never heard from again. While the 1584 scouting expedition had been a success, the 1585 colony was a complete failure. Relations with the Native Americans had completely deteriorated. The severe lack of food made life unbearable, and the colonists failed to discover any of the rumored sources of gold and copper that might have justified the venture. Despite all this, one man remained eager to return: John White. White was a painter and artist by trade, and many of the maps and sketches associated with the colony were either drawn by him or based on his work. Ironically, there are no surviving portraits of White himself. White's participation in the earlier voyages is somewhat unclear. He may have been part of the 1584 scouting expedition, but he was definitely involved in the 1585 voyage. However, it is unclear whether he stayed behind at the colony or returned to England with the outbound fleet. White's name does not appear on a surviving list of colonists, but some historians believe this is merely an oversight, and that he was indeed part of the colony. In any case, Sir Walter Raleigh was eventually persuaded by White and others to attempt another venture. Unlike the first colony, which was more of a military outpost, the second attempt would include women and children, including White's pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare. After a long struggle to secure the necessary funding, a fleet of 3 ships, commanded by White, who also served as the colony's governor, departed England in the late spring of 1587.
The misfortune of the first colony didn't end with its evacuation in 1586. Just days later, a ship filled with provisions sent by Sir Walter Raleigh arrived at the Outer Banks. The crew spent some time searching for the colonists, but when they found no sign of them, including the 3 men left behind, they returned home. The same happened 2 weeks later, when an English-bound fleet, loaded with supplies and reinforcements, also found the colony deserted. Unwilling to leave the colony vacant, the captain left 15 crewmen on Roanoke before the fleet sailed back to England. John White had been informed about these 15 crewmen before he set sail, so when his fleet approached the Outer Banks in late July of 1587, he intended to visit them. However, things took a confusing turn. The second colony wasn't meant to be established on Roanoke. Given the complications of the first colony, it was clear Roanoke was far from ideal. Instead, the plan was to plant the new colony, dubbed the City of Raleigh, somewhere along the coast of Chesapeake Bay. This location seemed better with deeper water, more open space, and fertile soil. Yet the Portuguese navigator, Simon Fernandez, who had sailed on previous expeditions and was more experienced than White, decided to ignore this plan and instead unloaded the colonists on Roanoke. Despite White's official role as captain, he didn't challenge Fernandez's decision, and soon, everyone disembarked on Roanoke. Upon reaching the abandoned colony, they found no sign of the 15 crewmen. Instead, there was a pile of bones, which seemed to be the remains of one of them. White suspected an attack by vengeful Indians, and this suspicion was confirmed when a colonist named George Howe was attacked by a group of natives, who struck him with arrows and a wooden club. A brutal message that the English were no longer welcome on Roanoke. However, not all interactions with the natives were hostile. During the scouting expedition of 1584, 2 Native Americans, Wanchese and Manteo, were brought back to England. Wanchese, from Roanoke, returned with resentment towards the English, while Mateo, from the neighboring island of Croatoan, became a trusted guide and mediator. Following George Howe's death, White reached out to the Croatoans, who confirmed that a large group of Indian tribes, led by Wanchese, had indeed attacked the 15 crewmen. At least 2 of the crewmen were killed, while the rest escaped in a small boat and were never seen again. The Outer Banks became a much more dangerous place to live. Fernandez remained anchored near the Outer Banks for about a month before deciding to return to England. Meanwhile, the colonists, concerned about their long-term survival, urged Governor White to return to England with Fernandez to bring back supplies. White, initially hesitant due to the fear of being accused of desertion and leaving his daughter and granddaughter behind, was eventually persuaded to go. As the fleet departed in late August 1587, he had no idea he would never see the colony again. After a long and difficult voyage, White returned to a country at war. The Queen had ordered no ships to leave England until the threat of a Spanish invasion had passed, trapping White in England for 3 long years. It wasn't until spring 1590, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, that White finally managed to secure passage to America. Upon reaching the Outer Banks in mid-August, plumes of smoke were seen emanating from Roanoke Island. Boats were dispatched, and the crew fired the ship's cannons to announce their arrival. They saw a great fire as they approached, but never clarified whether it was natural or man-made. On shore, they discovered a set of fresh footprints but no sign of the people they belonged to. Heading north, they found a tree with the letters CRO carved into it, and further along, they found the word CROATOAN engraved on a wooden post that was part of a defensive barrier around the colony. The colony itself was deserted, with overgrowth of grass and weeds, stripped houses, and no trace of the 115 colonists or their small boats. The story of the lost colony often revolves around these 2 engravings. Without full context, it's easy to imbue these inscriptions with mystery. In truth, the carvings are among the better understood elements of the story. White noted that before he left in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed that if they abandoned the colony, they would leave behind a secret token of their destination. If the abandonment was due to distress, they were to include a cross. Since no cross was found, White was confident the colonists had relocated to the island of Croatoan. White tried to convince the captain to head for Croatoan, but the anchor cable snapped, and without a spare anchor, the captain deemed it too dangerous to proceed. Consequently, White never made it to Croatoan, and it was the last time he ventured across the Atlantic. While this conclusion is unsatisfactory, it seems safe to assume the lost colony of Roanoke relocated to Croatoan. However, White's notes mention that the colonists were preparing to move 50 miles inland, but Croatoan is an island about 50 miles south of Roanoke, not part of the mainland. This discrepancy introduces doubt into White's version of events and leaves the question, if not Croatoan, where could they have gone? 20 years after the Roanoke Colony's establishment, the Anglo-Spanish War had ended. John White faded into obscurity, and Sir Walter Raleigh was convicted of treason for conspiring against the crown. While this might seem like a whole other story, renewed interest in America led to the establishment of a 3rd colony in 1607, the Jamestown Colony. Jamestown was founded within the territory of a vast confederation of Native American tribes ruled by a leader known to the English as Powhatan. During a visit to Powhatan, future Governor John Smith was informed about a place where men dressed in European clothing were said to live. After his release in 1608, Smith drew a rough map of Virginia, noting this mysterious location. Unfortunately, claims like these were never thoroughly investigated, leaving the details shrouded in mystery. Another unverified report suggested that all but a few of the colonists were massacred by Powhatan, with survivors supposedly scattered across the region. However, when White returned to Roanoke in 1590, he reported no signs of a battle or human remains. An acquaintance of John Smith later claimed that Powhatan had confessed to the massacre after Smith's capture, but Smith himself made no mention of such a confession, and he was known for embellishing stories. Other reports described Native American children with unusually pale skin and blonde hair, leading some to speculate that they were descendants of the lost colonists. At the time, however, it was unknown that albinism is more common among Native Americans than Europeans. A century later, English explorer John Lawson made contact with the Hatteras tribe, who lived in the same area as the Croatoans. The Hatteras spoke of ancestors who were white and could read, and had gray eyes, a trait unique to them, according to Lawson. They also mentioned a local legend about a ghost ship, which they referred to as Sir Walter Raleigh's ship. Lawson believed that the Hatteras were descendants of the lost colony, and that the two groups had merged over time. So we have two sources from over a century apart suggesting the same story. John White believed the colonists moved to Croatoan based on carvings, while Lawson's observations supported this idea with gray eyes and ghost legends. While not definitive, it forms a compelling argument. In late 2011, a significant discovery was made when examining White's map of Virginia. Patches, historically used to correct minor mistakes, were found to conceal a four-pointed star symbolizing a fort, which matched symbols on an early 17th century map. This fort was located on the mainland, about 50 miles west of Roanoke, and has since been referred to as Site X. While fragments of pottery and metal suggest an English presence, no direct link to the lost colony has yet been confirmed. The secrecy surrounding the fort's location may have been due to fears of Spanish spies intercepting sensitive information. Despite this, the precise location and existence of Site X remain uncertain. Some speculate that the colonists might have split into two groups, with one relocating to Site X, and the other living with friendly Croatoans while waiting for White's return. The harsh conditions, including drought, might have driven the relocation, and over time, the colonists may have assimilated with the indigenous people. Despite the compelling arguments, much of the evidence remains inconclusive. The potential discovery of the Dare Stone and other artifacts continues to fuel debate, but no definitive answers have emerged. As for the most important question, what truly happened to the lost colony? It remains buried somewhere in history, awaiting further discovery. Do you have any questions about the forsaken colonists? The reasons behind Fernandez's actions, the incomplete engraving, or the significance of everyone named John? If there is an answer to the mystery of the lost colony, it likely lies hidden in the past, waiting to be uncovered.